Let's start this evening with our conversation in Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews chapter 6. Because I want to look at this concept, that this idea of faithfulness, it's going to be accomplished through patience. There's a certain level of patience that's required. As I think about my appetite and what I want, I'm one who likes accomplishment, getting things done. And as you think about that, things aren't able to always get done in your time and the way you want those accomplished. I have to be forced in my life to wait on the Lord and not try to speed up that schedule and that process of getting things accomplished. And I think really in aspects of our lives, all of us require some level of patience in our journey and our walk with the Lord. Let's look in verse 11 of chapter 6 in Hebrews. And we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. The Hebrew writer here is wanting them to have full assurance of hope until the end, but understands this concerning that process of getting to the end. It will be accomplished by faith, but it will also be faith that is married or partnered with patience. And really, as we think about this, let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 3, as we talk about this concept of patience, and really reflect on how do we even have the opportunity to be patient with the Lord in our walk and wait on the Lord. And where does the hope come from but from the patience of God? Really, to have a full understanding of this month's theme of being faithful, hopeful until the end, we have to have an understanding that God has always been and will always be faithful. He's been faithful unto His promises and has been forced by us to have to be patient with us. Let's go to verse 18 of chapter 3 in 1 Peter. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that He might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which He went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey God, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Two things we need to observe concerning patience here. How do you think Noah responded to the patience of God? As he saw the world around him becoming increasingly more immoral and doing things wrong, what did he ask? How long, Lord? How long? And then he might even start asking this question, why, God? Why? And what Noah probably didn't understand fully in the moment was God had a love for those people with whom He was being patient with as much as He had for Noah. Noah loved those who were turning their backs on Him. God loved those who were violent and immoral, and therefore He was patient. I don't think it was His desire to only save 8. But as time went on, that's the only ones that were faithful and they were saved. And so you look that God's patience was there as an opportunity for repentance for those who lived around Noah. But Noah also had to wait. He had to wait for his salvation and his time to be brought out of that world that again was growing increasingly more violent and immoral. And so let's look at this one story which will help us embark on the character study of the night. Let's go to Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30. And we're going to talk this evening concerning Joseph. And if you want to talk about patience, it was Joseph. We sing about visions of grandeur, right? Joseph had visions of grandeur early on in his life. And he said, Lord, when will those be revealed? When will I get to see those promises fulfilled in my life? You know what the Lord said to him? Wait. Wait. And wait. And it required patience for Joseph to remain faithful. But Joseph really was brought into the world through patience. Genesis chapter 30 and verse 1, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, who at this point in time had become really her nemesis. She said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." She's waiting and waiting and waiting on children. All the while, Leah has 6 sons born for Jacob. And then even a daughter, to have 7 children, while Rachel waits and waits and waits. Verse 22 of chapter 30 in Genesis says, "Then God remembered Rachel." She at this point was asking, when God? She's already gotten so worried concerning this timeline that she's on, that she's even wished to die concerning the fact that she has no children. But God remembered. God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." There's beauty in that. That when God shows up and shows us the promises in our life, it instantly gives us hope. You notice here, she had previously had no children, and now what does she think is possible? I can have more. And really, she had reason to think that concerning what she knew about God and what she knew concerning the power of God, that all things were possible. If we think back to this morning, what we said concerning Jesus, He came to give you life, and life more abundantly. And so if you think about this concept of her now receiving this child, and now what does she instantly think? Oh, I'll have another. Now she had to wait many years on that second, but indeed she saw another. And so she names him Joseph, and she spins a little bit on the meaning of the name, meaning God will increase. That's the meaning of the name Joseph, is God will increase. So what I want us to think about before we start into the life of Joseph is this concept of the great hope that was shown to his mother when he was born. Now I have a child. Now I'm pleasing to my husband, and may he grant to me another. So let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, and what the Hebrew writer says concerning Joseph and his faith. Because I find it so interesting that there was so much hope present in his mother's life when he was born. And with his dying breath, he extends hope to the nation. Verse 21, by faith Jacob, that would be Joseph's father, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. The mention was this, that we will exit from this place. We will leave this place that we are in presently. And we will go to the promised land. At his birth, there was hope. And at his death, there was more hope. Because this was a man who patiently followed Jesus and was faithful to the end, and therefore he lived a life that was truly full of hope. Let's read the words that he spoke in Genesis chapter 50. Back in the Old Testament, in Genesis chapter 50, as he speaks here in verse 25 of chapter 50. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. But he let them know, this that you're dealing with presently, know this, God will visit you. Though it seems he may be far from you, because you're in the land that was not promised to your father, and it seems as though this is where we will end. This is where the story ends. Know this, it doesn't end here, because God will visit you. Joseph knew in his life God was faithful. And he promised unto them with his dying breath, God will be faithful to you as well. And you will leave this place. And you know, Israel did a very poor job of keeping the promises that their patriarchs told them about. But this particular promise, they actually kept. Let's go to Exodus chapter 13. Exodus chapter 13. It's rather shocking that we actually see they listen to the patriarch in this moment. Exodus chapter 13. In verse 19, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made them, the sons of Israel, solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. And then these bones even make it through the wandering of the wilderness, and they make it to Joshua, as Joshua has now conquered the land in Joshua chapter 24. They still have these bones here, and they place them exactly where Joseph had told them to place them. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. And I just wonder, as we think about that, who carried the bones? Not much is said of the bones. We know that, again, surprisingly concerning Israel, they actually kept this promise, but who carried the bones? Where did they stay? And we can wonder about that, but here's what I know for sure. So often, as the memorials were set up in these years of wanderings, and even Joshua, as he crosses in and he sets up those stones, what does he say concerning the memorials that they would have there? When your children ask. And I'm not certain that my children would ask concerning stones piled up in a certain place. But I can tell you this. They would ask about those bones. And they would ask and wonder, why do we keep on carrying this dead man's bones? And what is it that we would say concerning that dead man's bones? We would say, he spoke hope and he prophesied that we would indeed inherit the promised land. And what better legacy could there have been of Joseph's life than that? That he died believing in the promises of God. And he knew even that he would not realize life in the promised land. His heirs and his descendants would realize that promise. Isn't that conviction? And isn't that being faithful to the end? And we know that he never indeed inherited the physical land that God promised, but we know from that moment, after he whispered those words to his children, he was taken into the promised land, to Abraham's bosom, and dwells there. But he, in that promise, set forth legacy that he would be remembered as a man of hope. Because again, he was brought into this world, and when he was brought into this world, he brought so much hope to his mother. And with his dying words, he gives hope unto Israel. So let's go back and just look at different portions of his life. Let's look in Genesis chapter 37, because you want to talk about Genesis chapter 37. Let's continue this idea and looking at the life of Joseph. Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 9 concerning Joseph. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I've dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told it to his father and his brothers rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. And so he is, in many ways, plagued by this dream and this vision. It's a great vision that there's some exaltation that's going to take place with him, and he sees that. But when is it that he finally gets to realize that in his life? Not after, it comes after years and years and years of patience. Even immediately when he gives this vision and this dream of grandeur to the people, he's rebuked even by his own parents concerning this. So as we look here in verse 12, now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. And he said to him, Here I am. So he said to him, Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word. So he went. He sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and a man asked him, What are you seeking? I'm seeking my brothers, he said. Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock? And the man said, They have gone away, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar. Before he came near, they conspired against him to kill him. And we know how the rest of the story goes. They're just talked out of killing them. Reuben comes up with this idea, let's don't kill him, but let's just put him in a dark, deep, cold pit and leave him there alone. That's a better idea, right? And then in verse 29, Reuben returns to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit. He tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? And so then they conspire against their own father, and what's happened is he's been sold into slavery. This is a man who had a vision, or a young man who had a vision concerning his life of grandeur, and now he finds himself enslaved, sold into slavery. Previously at the bottom of the pit, and now taken up from the pit, and now he's in slavery. And this could be the very moment in his life where he says, where is God? Why is God not providing for me? Why is God not looking after me? This really would be the time in his life when he said, I need to just make my own way. Because I've been following after God's way, and it's not worked out. So chapter 39, let's start in chapter 39. And now he's in Egypt. Potiphar is now his master, so to speak. Chapter 39 and verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hand. I find it interesting that early on in this relationship that he has, who's at the centerpiece of this conversation that's going on concerning Joseph? The Lord is there. Who do we think brought up the Lord? Who do we think brought up God's plan and the fact that God was favoring Joseph? But it was Joseph. In a time in his life when he could have forgotten God, rejected God, and many would argue rightfully so, this is really when he even held on to God more firmly. And we see when he had every moment to turn and be unfaithful, he in many ways became more faithful now than he ever had been. And it's because he saw this moment of challenge as a time when he would grow closer to God instead of distancing himself from God. And so it is that this Egyptian leader is compelled, forced to recognize the God of heaven. And it's because this man has determined in his heart that he's going to be always faithful. And we know that it would have been Joseph that would have brought up this conversation concerning God. And he had God so closely with him in all that he did. He understood that he was being truly faithful to God. We talked about this morning your why. And your why can't be something external and it can't be pleasing somebody else. It has to be wholly focused on God and answering for the sacrifice that He's made in your life and wanting to be united with Him, or else there's no way you can overcome everything else is being thrown at you. You notice that that's the process that we have in Joseph's mind being revealed to us. Potiphar's wife is coming on to him, desiring him. Verse 7 of chapter 39. Verse 7 of chapter 39. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Again, if you think about his life and what he's gone through, this is the one who should have been forgotten. But it is Joseph now retelling the story of God and saying, I have a relationship with God. I'll not let you disrupt that relationship. And that has to be our attitude about everything. That has to be our attitude about people we come in contact with. There's only so close we can be because I can't allow you to interrupt the relationship that I have with God. How is it that Joseph was forever faithful? He said, first and foremost, I will be faithful to God. And so with everything that we consume our lives with, we cannot let it interfere with that relationship that we have with God. And we see that at the forefront of his mind in everything that he did, it was, how will this impact my relationship with God? And here's what happened. And we talked about this last Sunday night. Concerning this concept of how do we remain forever faithful? How do we do it? How do we do it and make it all the way to the end? Well, verse 10 gives us insight into that. Verse 10, and as she spoke to Joseph day after day. How are you going to remain faithful? Don't win your whole life. And don't take it that this month's preaching is this concept of winning your whole life. This month's preaching is winning the day. Winning the challenges of the day with God by your side. And then before you know it, tomorrow you can look back and you were faithful yesterday and you're going to be faithful today. And that's the process that's going on here in Joseph's life is every day he has to answer this question, how can I do this and sin against God? God becomes the forefront of his mind daily. And that's exactly how we're going to do this. That's exactly how we're going to remain faithful to the end. Verse 11, things take a kind of a turn. And you see that there's already been one time in Joseph's life where things are going good. I'm having dreams, and it looks like I'm going to be prominent in people's lives. People are going to be bowing down to me. Wait a second, now I'm a slave. But now he's a slave, and he's made it to a very high place, a very good status, a slave, but a pretty high status for a slave. And things take a turn for the worse. Verse 11. But one day when he went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the house were there in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, she fled out of the house. She called the men of the household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story. Now in verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, the place where his king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison. Completely innocent. In this moment, as we analyze his life, completely faithful to God. But yet again, something happens. He was in the pit earlier, and now he finds himself in prison. But we find this again as a time when he could have turned his back on God. But he remained faithful even there in prison. We see a glimmer of hope in his life in prison. We all know how the story goes. He starts interpreting dreams. And these are some people who are going to have contact with the king, and he says, just remember me. Just remember me. And I'm telling you, if I'm Joseph in that prison, I see that as my sign from God that I will soon be delivered from prison. And we know the story. We know how that went. Verse 23 of chapter 40 in Genesis. Verse 23 says, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And he's in prison for even longer. The worldly hope that he had for release was gone. But I can't help but read that and think about the words that it says concerning Rachel, his mother. But the Lord remembered. How often in her life do you think she said, God has forgotten me? But she waited, and we read, and it says, and the Lord remembered her. And eventually we know how this story goes and how things happen. The Lord sees to it that he gets his appointment with the king. He gets his appointment with Pharaoh and gets his opportunity to interpret the dream. And he talks about concerning the famine. And notice what becomes, again, the centerpiece of this conversation. This should be a hardened man at this point in time. But he's made a determination. How could I do that and sin against God? It wasn't just sexual immorality that he saw as a sin against God. It was doubts and questions and hardening of a heart that he saw as a sin against God. And so he did not allow himself to harden his heart in that prison cell. But he came out really enthusiastically. So they have this issue. They're all going to perish through the famine. Verse 37 of chapter 41 in Genesis. Verse 37 of chapter 41 in Genesis. This proposal, this plan that they have to store up food, it pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Here we have, yet again, Pharaoh, just like Potiphar had to do, recognizing the God of heaven. All because of the attitude, the mannerisms, and the faithfulness of Joseph. Foreign people are having to recognize God. How is it that the Spirit of God was brought into this conversation? Do you think that it was Pharaoh who brought that up? Or better yet, was it Joseph and the manner in which he carried himself? Verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and gold chain about his neck. And finally, the dreams of that young boy are realized. And it's the plan that he puts in place here that will bring his father there and his brothers there, and they will indeed bow down to him because he has the food. But as we talked about last Sunday night, it's not a straight line. Joseph didn't have the dreams and then realize them. It was only through patience that Joseph was able to see how God was truly at work in his life. And I wonder what stories his mother would have told him. And at this point in his time, if he reflects back on what his mother told him, I was forgotten and forgotten. And Leah, your aunt, was blessed. And she was blessed, and she was blessed, and I was forgotten. But then the Lord remembered me. And now Joseph, in this moment, as he's been directed by Pharaoh to be so high in the kingdom, reflects back and he knows for sure God is with him. He has waited on the Lord, and the Lord has exalted him in the appropriate time. In God's time, he was exalted. I want to close our thoughts this month in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, which has nothing to do with Joseph, and I understand that. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. The reason we're doing this is because, as I told you, it was hard to fit everything in. But I want you to think about this. There are so many characters in the Bible that we see and we think of as great heroes of faith. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 is where we're going. But it wasn't a smooth journey. It wasn't you walk up out of the water graves of baptism and now you're faithful to the end. It wasn't a journey like that at all. It was a journey that no doubt imposed questions and imposed struggles. We see the answers that Joseph arrived at, but what questions did he have to ask to arrive at those answers? And what was he thinking about in those lonely, lonely nights? We have recorded for us only a few days of those prison nights. But what was he thinking? It matters not what he was thinking, but what does matter is the answer that he arrived at, which is God is always faithful. He arrived at that and believed it so firmly in the end that, again, his last words are words of hope. And you think about the Apostle Paul, who found himself in a similar manner. He turned away from everything that he knew. How many family members did he have to say no to? How radically different were the holidays for him because of the commitment that he made? And if we're looking at this as a worldly event, we would think that Paul, the Apostle Paul, should have seen grandeur and should have been blessed in so many ways. Should have been one of the most wealthiest men on the planet. But he tells us of his journey, and he tells us of his walk in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And that's not the picture he paints for us. It wasn't always rosy. It wasn't always easy. But what he knew was what God would tell him later concerning the thorn in his flesh, as he calls it. What was God's answer for that? My grace is sufficient. And I think really that becomes the way in which we're going to be faithful. Is we're going to be satisfied with that answer. My grace is sufficient. And he showed us that grace on the cross. He showed us that grace on the cross. And now what do? Believe, obey, the work is done. That's the picture of grace. And it gets ugly at times, and Paul records that for us in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 24. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. I'm going to read that again because that is insanity. 39 lashes on the back with a whip made for destruction. There are those who would have died from those lashings. That was the intent of it. They go -1 just at the chance that they would live. He didn't receive it one time. Could you imagine 5 times? Would you have quit after the first and called it good? Blamed God for the circumstances you're in? What about after the second time? 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day. I was adrift at sea. Who would have quit by now? There's so many sermons we can preach from here. But brethren, as we read this, can you honestly say you've ever been persecuted today in your life? Do we have room to talk about the struggles in our life? Do we have room to talk about how difficult it is to remain faithful? But he kept on. What he's saying through this is there was nothing that was going to keep me from serving my God. And that's the commitment that all of us in this room have got to make. Verse 26, he says, on frequent journeys, in danger from river, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's a daily pressure on me of my anxieties for all the churches. And I think that's a beautiful summation of his life. His anxieties for what? My anxieties would be, when's the next time I'm going to get beaten for this? When's the next time I'm going to be shipwrecked? What's his anxieties in his mindset? What's he worried about? He quit a long time worrying about himself. How'd you remain faithful? I quit worrying about myself. I quit worrying about how my back looked. I'm not trying to win a beauty pageant. I'm done with how my back looks. It looked horrible. 5 times beaten. It looked horrible. I'm done relying on ships. They'll either get me there or they won't. But he didn't worry about it, did he? What did he worry about? He worried about the brethren. And the sooner we can get out of ourselves and quit worrying about our circumstances and our situations, the sooner we'll start living faithful until death. That's exactly the picture that Paul paints for us. Is quit worrying about everything else that could go on. Start worrying about spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because it's the only thing that's going to bring real hope to people's lives. What's keeping you from being faithful? Is there something we can do to help you tonight? Could you come forward and we pray with you? Strengthen you through Scriptures to help you remain faithful? Or is it this, you've never started on your walk and your journey, you've never been baptized into Jesus Christ, never been raised to walk in newness of life? Let us help you start that journey tonight. Whatever we can do to help you this evening, we pray that you do so. Together we stand and as we sing.